Hello, guys. Settlers Lament here, and we're back with another discussion. And sorry, I know in the title it says that Renaissance Man is supposed to be here. He ended up having some technical problems, so we have Cringe Walker to replace him. But yeah, I think the title is pretty self-explanatory for this. Today we will be discussing the attempt by the left and just the Enlightenment in general to separate morality and religion from politics. What are the effects of that? Where has that left us today? All that type of stuff. So yeah, that's the basic topic. 21. This was more or less your idea. So do you got anything to go off of?
Well, yes, it was my idea. Unfortunately, I was trying to tailor it for Renaissance Man since he has a more theological background. But basically, the story goes that basically the theory of power, divine right, all the basic ethos and justification for a government was inherently religious and moral. It was tied in with the basic purpose of the government for most of the Middle Ages. And then with the Reformation, we have a series of pretty gruesome religious wars. And the people of that time eventually lose their stomach for emphasizing these divisions in conflicts. So there comes a compromise, and this is expressed best in the US. There comes a compromise where they decide not to emphasize those differences for the sake of having a government that's not really based on those differences, so that they don't have to fight over it. But in doing that, that means they have to, it becomes separated from the political sphere. Even though they're integrally linked, they cause a separation from that if they're not going to make a government based on a state religion or state ideology. It loses its strength in the society. And then eventually this devolves into, well, we're not going to talk about this at all in this political sphere, as we have now, where Christians aren't allowed to really discuss their religious beliefs in terms of political issues or policy. So eventually, when you separate those things, politics devolves into an amoral game of power and chaos, honestly.
I would say that that's kind of what politics is by definition. I think anytime
Sorry,
you have...
I meant an amoral. I meant it's an amoral grasp for power instead of justification for power from some religious source.
No, I think I know that's what you said. I think that it is always an amoral grasping for power, and politics, I think, doesn't actually have much relevance to morality. I think it is essentially an amoral force that, there might be people who attempt to go through political means to achieve some moral end, but I think they're completely decoupled from each other. And I think it's actually better to get rid of politics if you want to have the most moral government. If you're trying to govern by some objective morality. I think politics is really just a means to actually degrade that by opening up the opportunities to alter that foundation. And if by definition your foundation is objectively some higher moral order that you're trying to institute, then any change from that is necessarily a degradation, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand your point, and it's a difficult question because I think about it often. Where is it when you are playing the game of politics, when you are politicking, it is in a sense amoral, because you have to win in competition against people that are less moral than you. So, like you said, you can use politics in order to achieve a moral goal. I think that would be the preference to have. It's just a difficult question where, okay, well, what is the purpose of law? The purpose of law is to enforce morality. But if you continue to obfuscate the moral conversation and the religious conversation, then there's no sense of what these laws are going to be based on and what's the reasoning for any of these laws. So that's kind of my point. The point of politics as in power competition, I agree with you that it is amoral inherently, so it must be ended.
Yeah, I agree. I think a large part of the solution to the problems of the immoral government we see now, that a lot of us have problems with, is actually um, to remove politics from the equation, essentially, not to try and figure out the most moral means of politicking, but just to sidestep it altogether. I mean, if you think about some of the older regimes you mentioned, I think politics would be constrained to the aristocracy and court of the monarch at best, and not distributed throughout the entire population. I think especially when politics is distributed, there's even more opportunity for abuse and the institution of immoral laws. I think that's a big part of why we see so much immorality in government today, is that politics is something that everyone engages in.
Essentially, it's I mean, the current form of politics is essentially who is going to be the best at leading a giant looting project over an entire nation and international economy. That's basically what it is right now. It's just a looting operation of several factions, and of course that's going to be very destructive.
Does that
Well, yeah,
do?
it's I mean it's really interesting how like modern democratic structures work with politics. They tell everyone that they have to be involved in politics, that if you're not involved, you're like being a bad person. You get a lot of this sort of shaming if you don't vote or something like that. I mean, I do normally vote. Not sure if I will in the future. Definitely would never vote for a major Canadian party again. But you get all this sort of social pressure to involve yourself in the political process, while simultaneously having no real ability to change anything whatsoever. So it's like I remember back in 2016, there were all these articles about lefties getting depression and stuff and being suicidal over Trump winning. And I remember the like anti-SJW types making fun of them and being like, "Oh, this is so stupid. Why do you care so much?" But really, our entire society is structured in a way to tell you that you're a political unit. You need to really care about politics, and you personally have the ability to make a change. Now, all that's a lie. Any individual has no ability to make any meaningful change unless you're one of the like 10,000 people that actually have some meaningful degree of power. So I think it really causes a lot of cognitive dissonance in people's heads, where you're constantly told that you matter and that your political opinion can make a difference, but you don't actually have any ability to do that. And when people are told these conflicting things, I understand why they get very upset when they're told that the world's falling apart and it's their fault because they didn't make the necessary political changes.
Yeah, and is that just like a raw sense of power as like something to gain without any regard for anything else?
I think in some ways that's what the U.S. government allows people to do, is to, I mean, USG is basically a services organization, and it provides you with the services that you tell it you want, allegedly, and it's sort of a zero cost service provider to you. You just sort of, I mean, ultimately it is actually zero cost, right? Because there are all sorts of ways you pay for it. But the perspective of it is just this free service provider, right? And nothing is free, and ultimately anything it provides is going to be taken from someone else. So it's sort of this convoluted way of basically acquiring property from other people and bringing it to yourself just through saying you want it, basically. I mean, that's basically what voting is. It's saying I want something and I want someone else to give it to me, and I'm going to have the government take it for me in my stead, basically.
Yeah.
And just to answer for really quick in the comments, just so we don't get confused, when Charlemagne was identifying politics, I'm pretty sure he was saying power competition itself. So just simply vying for some sort of power somewhere. That's what politics is. And I'm assuming, Charlemagne, when you're saying the solution, if you want to have a fundamental moral order in a government, you would want to end politics. Well, of course, this is still the political structure, but I think by ending politics, you're saying ending power competition and formalizing it in one person or one entity.
I would say specifically power competition over sovereignty, and that's what modern politics is. And it says that everyone is sovereign, right? I mean, the way universal suffrage basically works is that we all sort of share a bit of sovereignty, and we have this participatory means of exercising that sovereignty. But that's not actually the case, right? It's still the case that that sovereignty is vested in a certain class of oligarchs or aristocrats, however you want to view them, and it's not distributed like they say it is. And this actually leads to some bad consequences, right? Because when you tell people that you have a share in sovereignty and you exercise it by voting, and then you do that and it doesn't work, people then continue their politics by other means when the stated means of exercising their sovereignty doesn't actually seem to work like it's supposed to. I think that's how you get all of this extra political activism we see now that's bleeding into what you might call woke capital and NGOs and things like that, right? Because the stated means of having sovereignty doesn't work, and people feel like they are owed sovereignty, that they ought to have it for themselves. Which sovereignty is the exercise of an unaccountable power. Basically, people believe that they have the right to direct the unaccountable power that sits at the top of our hierarchy, and that's a very dangerous thing to tell most people, I think.
Yeah, this is something that I find some normies don't really comprehend because of the sort of democratic meme. But there always has to be some sovereign and some form of sovereignty, some sort of power which is unaccountable. Because you'll get stuff like the Supreme Court doing crazy things, and I'll get some normie telling me like, why don't you just stop? Why don't they just stop that? And it's like, who's the they? Like the Supreme Court, like they're the dudes in charge. Is it the president? If it's the president, then you don't really have a Supreme Court, at least not in the sense that we conceive of it. And if the Supreme Court, and if it's reversed, if the president can't affect the Supreme Court, which is what it currently is, then that means the Supreme Court has power over the president. There's the sort of democratic meme that we're given makes people assume that there's some way to keep these things in check, and there really isn't. There has to be a power that keeps other powers in check but doesn't keep itself in check. There's no way really to end that.
Yeah, that's, I guess, the problem with morality and politics working together, is that we've ended up in this convoluted system where the accountability chain is so complex, or potentially even non-existent in some cases, that there is no means of holding people accountable or organizations accountable in many cases in terms of their moral failings.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because like morality is something that you kind of have on like your political B plot, if you will, that keeps the A plot in line almost.
Could you elaborate on that?
Like power exists whether you're moral or not, but power with morality can be used well or or cruelly if you're oppressive in your morality. There's like a triumph of there almost, where you need the power, the moral use of it, and then the ability to have almost like I guess what would be the word, not grace, but like mercy in that. Like you'd have like without mercy, if you have power and morality, you have like SJWs. If you have power and mercy but no morality, you have like a pushover state, an occupied state, basically. These are like kind of a trinity of effective governance, maybe.
I'm curious, Charlemagne. You were talking about politics is an amoral game. Well, I think it might just be talking past each other, where I'm thinking, well, the main purpose of politics, of gaining power, is imposing your own world or your own morality on some group of people or some jurisdiction. So I still feel a bit confused at the idea that politics is purely amoral. I think the basic purpose of it is to enforce morality, correct?
I guess it depends on how you really want to determine what morality is. Perhaps you could say, if you want to say that, I think most oligarchs are acting out of some sort of master morality system, right? So if you want to regard that as a moral system, then yes, power and politics and morality are more or less inseparable, because whoever has power is always going to be acting in a way that serves their particular interests. And if their interests are some sort of master morality framework, where basically their interests are the highest interests, then yeah, I think that's not really what most of us would be talking about when we talk about morality. Um, I don't think anyone here is particularly Nietzschean in their moral outlook. So I would just say it depends. And I mean, it depends on how you define politics as well. I mean, I mentioned competition for power in aristocracies previously, and you could call that politics if you wanted, right? And it would be reasonable to call it politics, but it's definitely distinct from what we consider politics to be today in a democracy with universal suffrage, right? So these are very different beasts depending on what system of government you're in and what kind of moral framework you're actually operating in.
I think what you're talking about is popular politics, because the word politics isn't anything new. It definitely existed before modern governments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's sort of a view of politics. I think makes sense to address the question, and because popular politics is the system we exist in the whole Western world at the moment.
Well, perhaps I'm just trying to wrap my hand around this idea and how it applies to the progressives, because the progressives are very convicted. Perhaps it's incorrect, but they are convicted that they have a moral worldview, maybe a kind of vague egalitarian universalism that they want to impose on the world. So and in order to do that, they acquire power, seize power for themselves. That seems like people using politics to impose their morality. It's the same purpose of enforcing morality, but the only issue is that their morality is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although I think the progressives aren't exactly the people in power. I think the people in power are not. They don't have the same moral framework as the progressives would like to see installed. I don't think it's actually likely or even possible for the progressives to actually get what they want, because the elites are only ever going to install any such framework out of their own interests. I guess on an objective level, yeah, they're trying to institute what they see as a moral order. I do think that progressives tend to act more in self-interest, though, than in their stated interests regarding egalitarianism generally. I think it's more often out of self-interest that they act than out of genuine empathy for people they see as disadvantaged.
Yeah, it's almost like a generation goes into debt. Suddenly, student debts matter for their reasons, but they don't really care about other things. Just to choose one example of that.
Okay, so you've established that they are kind of cynical actors that have a thin surface level morality that they purport to have at the very least, and they seize power for their own self-interest in the end. Well, how do we deal with this problem that, of course, mentioning any kind of traditional religion in a political discussion is completely anathema now? How do we address that problem? Because that's the point that I'm having here, where the political sphere is going to deteriorate more and more and more over time because of that fundamental problem. Well, where is your worldview coming from? Where are these basic principles that you want to enforce on people coming from?
This is a problem I've encountered pretty frequently. I think the way to do it is when you encounter these people who claim to be not trying to enforce their morals on other people. This is a refrain you often hear from people who kind of have the Lawbert mindset and complain whenever you try to enforce any religious morality, or even say you would like it enforced, like not even doing it yourself, right? They sort of accuse you of wanting to enforce your morals on other people, but won't won't accept that they're also trying to do that, and their moral framework might just happen to be like, let me do whatever I want in my own house, if it doesn't, as long as it doesn't directly affect anyone else, or something like that, right?
The paradox of liberalism in that it must be enforced.
Yeah, but if you point out that they actually are, they're still trying to enforce a moral framework onto everyone else by allowing this to be how society works. That's one way that can be addressed. And once you do that, you just assert that you're also you also have a moral framework that you want to be governed by, and you're just doing the same thing as them. So yeah, I mean, so morality and politics are definitely not separate on the left. They are intertwined with each other, and they're intertwined on the right. I think the problem with morality and politics is the fact that you get all of these opposing interests confronting each other. It's not really, you can't have a government that makes sense if it's trying to govern by competing moral frameworks that can't coexist with each other. So when I say we should separate morality and politics, I think what that means is that we need to have a consistent moral system, and it can't just be up for grabs, right? It can't be that you can alter the moral system of government to be progressive one day and then try and flip it back to some sort of conservative framework on the other, because that's not stable, and governments really exist to provide a stable order for people to live in. So I mean, yeah, that's how I have tried to address that sort of claim in the past. It's pretty frustrating to have to deal with, because it should seem obvious that you're trying to enforce a moral framework when you say that people should be allowed to do whatever they want, basically. But people have been conditioned to view any sort of atheistic outlook as amoral and not as a moral framework in of itself, even though it is.
Right, which is, this is exactly what I'm thinking of, because when I'm thinking of the convergence between morality and politics, I'm thinking of what I see in the modern West, which is basically one dominant religious faction attacking the other ones. So this is why I'm thinking of when I think that there's conflicting moral systems, and each of these factions that adhere to different moral systems are fighting over power for it. That's the issue that I really see. So I understand that sometimes the progressives gaslight, say they're not imposing morality, or the lulberts gaslight saying they're not imposing morality, but fundamentally they're another religious faction, and they've obviously gained much benefit by denying the reality that they're a religious faction and restricting the religious discussion from any other faction. But I can't unsee that. It's just, it seems more like a soft religious war than the slow dissociation between politics and morality.
Well, a soft religious war is definitely an accurate description of what's happening now, and I think politics really enables this war to happen. I think if you limit the areas in which politics is useful and can be used to shift what a government is, the more you can keep it aligned with some moral framework. Like, one of the problems with the U.S., for example, the U.S. Constitution is, you can alter it in any way you want, right? I mean, the Constitution isn't a stable document that sort of permanently defines how the United States is supposed to be, because it can be altered, and it has been altered, right? That's what amendments are. They're additions or alterations, through crossing out paragraphs and replacing them with new ones. They're alterations of the original document, right? And you can think about, like, in terms of how senators are elected now as compared to when the Constitution was written. So when you don't have any sort of permanent basis for how your system's supposed to work, and it is entirely up to opinion, up to politics, how it's actually founded, then you sort of, I think, open up the ground for this religious war to actually take place, because there's nothing saying that you have to to maintain this order that we have, right? So there is what's happening now with the progressives is totally compatible with the United States, the model it's built on, because it had a mechanism to get here legitimately in the first place, because there's nothing saying that certain principles that may or may not be enshrined in the Constitution are unalterable, right? The entire thing is alterable.
Yeah, I was just want to say, like, it's a tool invented by progressives to counter a more traditional conservative, like, monarchical system. So it's like trying to use that system to establish morality or power, like something more conservative is probably a bit like, trying to use like a spoon as a fork or something.
Yeah, I mean, with the American Revolution, it's always an interesting example. Some people are really hard on it, and there's some justification for that. But if you go back and read a lot of the stuff from then, it's not as simple as the Americans just having been 1700s progressives. It's a bit more complicated, but the issue is there was both a progressive and a conservative impulse there. And looking back, it seems like there was no question who would win. As there has been no question who would win for the past 500 years or so. At the time, it may never look like the progressive victory is assured, but after the fact, they just always win. But in one of the sort of most commonly cited things on this topic is, I believe, Federalist 10, which talks about the problem of a pluralistic society with many different people with many different moral systems. And the traditional reading of Federalist 10 is that what the document claims is that that people have significantly divergent moral systems. And in particular in the Americas, they're talking about you had most people were Protestant, but they had many different types of Protestantism, and then they had different types of politics too. In addition to that. So the traditional reading of this document is that what it's saying, and this is what you'll generally see if you see like a summary of it in a textbook or something, is that what this document is saying is that a pluralistic society, you just can't really come to a synthesis on morality, and you just need to allow people to perceive their own version of the common good in whatever way they can, and the government just needs to provide a framework for that. And that's pretty clear how that leads to not just libertarianism, but how that sort of sweeping under the rug what exactly morality is leads to even progressivism. Because of course the progressives obviously to anyone on the right, progressives have a very strict moral system, but progressives pretend they don't have a moral system, which is somewhat unique compared to many other ideologies. Of course, libertarians are one of the groups that are similar on this. But traditionally, the idea of like denying that you have a moral system isn't something people normally would have done. But what's really interesting about Federalist 10, if you actually just read it, it's not quite as obvious that what it's saying is that that what it's saying is that the society just needs to be a framework for competing moral systems. The document itself has these two tensions in it: the progressive side and the conservative side. And it's the issue is that it was an unresolved tension then, and even now it's still to some extent an unresolved tension. This is just something that's been in the American experiment since the beginning. And it's clear when you don't resolve this, who wins.
The government must be a slot machine for the free marketplace of ideas, and whichever idea just comes out of the slot machine at the end is clearly the right one, and it seems to be the same one over and over.
One of the big problems with politics is we have liberal politics, right? And one of the interesting things about liberalism is that if you adhere to this whole concept of the marketplace ideas of ideas, and basically tolerate the expression of ideas freely, liberalism basically introduces the means of its own destruction. And if you want to prevent that from happening, then you have to actually be inconsistent with the liberal philosophy, and I'm talking about social liberalism here. You have to be inconsistent with it in terms of disallowing certain things that could potentially be threats from expressing themselves, right? And I think That's really the problem with this idea of pluralism in politics, because you can't there's no way to actually maintain that against threats, if you're not going to prevent certain ideas from allowing themselves to be expressed in the first place. I think that's where, and it's fair that I think the Americans didn't see modernity coming, but the problem is the moral framework that they relied on for liberalism to stay functional evaporated, and that opened the ground for ideas that could destroy liberalism to express themselves, which is what happened for sure by the 20th century, where it was basically replaced with progressivism and socialism.
Yeah, and I mean, politics have always existed, not even just not even just the fact that there's always been governments, but politics has always existed in the sense there's even been different political factions within governments, since the ancient Roman Empire, since the Middle Ages, groups like the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. There's always been sort of different political factions. The sort of core to a stable society, though, is that the different political factions need to really agree on the fundamentals. And once that sort of breaks up, once there isn't a very strong consensus between the different factions, is when you get to the sort of chaos that you have today, which really couldn't be summed up better than in the peaceful protests all throughout the states, where you have one half of the country that likes American history and likes what America once was, or the sort of narrative of what America once was, and you have the other half that literally wants to tear it down. And anything like that can't be anything like that can't have any sort of societal cohesiveness. It can't have the sort of stability that you could have had. The sort of post-war consensus is a sort of type of this where it did guarantee stability for at least a period. But the issue is that all the fundamentals that were there were ready to run away with it to get to the extreme things that we now have.
Yeah, and like even within that metric, you see the same people who are angry over former slave owners casually ignoring their own heroes' racism. Like Marx was fairly racist at times, and so it's even then it's like it's not being treated equally by those who claim to be moral. They're willingly ignoring their own their own philosophers' past sins to attack the past sins of our philosophers. So like, how do you really counter them when they're not willing to play on that like equal footing?
Well, I think acknowledging this is a point in Charlemagne's favor, as he's discussing that politics really can't be attached to morality in that way, because any kind of morality would at least conflict with your success in acquiring more power, at least in the current system. So, of course, if we just to point out the normie cons, the boomer cons, and just mainstream anti-progressives have the serious problem of, well, my opponent is searching for truth or for some consistent morality like me, and so why are there all these hypocrisies and these inconsistencies? That doesn't make any sense, when really the problem is, yes, politics is amoral. In order to acquire power, you have to break your own rules, essentially. So hypocrisy is an indication of them being very consistent. They're consistently inconsistent, because the actual goal is not truth or some kind of consistent moral order. It's pleasure, status, or power. So it's very unfortunate, but hypocrisy basically identifies successful hypocrisy. Identifies who's actually in power, because if you were a hypocrite and you didn't have power, then you'd be smacked down, right?
Mm-hmm. What I'm thinking right now as we talk is that it seems like politics and morality inevitably interact with each other, and the way to we talked earlier about how power in politics always exists, right? the way to prevent that from shifting the moral framework of your society in ways you wouldn't want it to is to limit the space in which politics operates. And universal suffrage is the antithesis of limiting it, right? So I sort of come back to this problem, I guess, is solved by removing politics as much as possible, right? If you want to prevent politics from causing moral decline, I think the correct way about it is not to make moral adjustments per se, but to make political adjustments in terms of taking away the distribution of political power from the entire population. And of course, doing that is a lot easier said than done. I'm not sure if there is a way to do it at this point.
On that topic, because I guess related to some history here, I was reading Einhardt's records of Charlemagne's early life, ironically Charlemagne. And what I found interesting is that even in the late 700s, when Rome had been gone for centuries, Einhard makes note that Charlemagne had to win an election to become king, and not just any election. It sounded as if it was the old Roman plebeian style of elections, where you gather the plebs into mobs, and whoever yells loudest wins. And so I found this interesting, that relic of an earlier semi-democratic era of the Roman era had remained in some sense still within the medieval era into monarchy. This is before divine right rule, when you chose your kings by the old Roman way. They didn't call them governors anymore, or Caesars, or anything like that. They still called them kings, but they were using an electoral system that the Romans had. And I don't know, I found it interesting that there's a little bleed over. If you want to transition to a system which has limited suffrage to decrease the blabbering of different voices and focus on how to govern correctly, it isn't necessarily incompatible with phasing out slowly the older systems, because as far as I'm aware, France continued using that method of election straight up into the Louis of I forget what dynasty, but much later on. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
That's pretty interesting. That could actually, I could imagine that acting as a counterbalance to, I guess, government by Twitter.
That's actually kind of something, not that particular example, but that concept is something Moldbug has talked about before. That is, when political changes happen, the forms are often kept, but not the reality. The Roman Empire is a great example of this. That when the Roman Empire went from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, they kept the Senate, and the Senate was still there, doing all the Senate things, but the real power was held entirely by the emperor. And one of the points he makes is that if the New York Times was around then, they probably would have been covering all the day-to-day happenings of the Senate. And if you were to read the mainstream media, if it existed in the modern sense, you'd probably be under the impression that when the Caesars were in power, everything that was important was actually going on in the Senate, when they were basically just rubber stamping everything, and they had no real power anymore. But yeah, so I mean that's a quite common trend, is to keep the old forms without the old substance. I mean, even America is a good example of this, as we've noted before. The four major republics that America has gone through, it's kept all the forms, it's kept all the talk of the Constitution and the founders. Even to this day, you still have even people like Joe Biden referencing the constitutional norms. Yet the how power actually flows in the government has changed massively, at least 4 major times.
Anakin, you were giving an interesting example in the French monarchy. What do you think of how the parliament, some kind of limited suffrage? How do you think that turned out in the English monarchy? Because in that case, it looks like a evil satanic cancer that metastasized over time and swallowed it whole.
Yeah, are you talking about current politics? How the monarchy was basically slowly phased
out?
Well,
I was wondering, because I don't really know much about the French monarchy example. I think it's kind of novel and interesting, but in the constitutional monarchy, structure that the English set up, it eventually allowed the parliament to overtake the monarch, of course, and it just continued. The slippery slope of suffrage never ends. Like there's,
Yeah.
I don't think there's a thing as limited suffrage. That's my only problem with it.
Yeah, I think those would be good bookends for different phasings. 'Cause like the French example is a slow shifting from the earlier Republican model and the Romans into the eventually divine right monarchy. And again, in terms of local Roman politics, I'm pretty sure some sense of democracy remained, but obviously at the imperial level, it became like a farce. Whereas like in London, the London model is like it slowly went the opposite way, where like you went from divine right rule into eventually full-blown full suffrage parliament. I still think that parliament has within itself the ability to compete against raw democracy, because you saw even with the Brexit situation how like it was a fight definitely between the democratic will to leave and the nobles of the country who wanted to stay, and democracy won in the long run, but you saw how it was still an incredible struggle across like 4 years. I would say the London model, the Westminster model, still has a significant tools to compete against raw democracy, as seen in the Brexit model, where like I think it still has the ability to reform to like be stronger there. Although I guess most people would be more on the democratic side for the Brexit situation.
I was thinking about what you were saying on plebiscites earlier, and I think this might be a moment where the way I think about democracy has actually changed a little, because I'm thinking about the way we vote now. It sort of conceals the filth, I suppose, because it's blind. You don't know who's voting for what, but if you actually had this sort of archaic model where people actually had to gather and actively express what they wanted in public in a crowd, I wonder to what extent the people who want to we can go to the extreme route and put the trans person or whatever in the elementary school classroom, right? How successful is that going to be in a public plebiscite, as opposed to when you can cause these policies to happen, sort of blindly? I think that actually is an interesting way to constrain what can be done in a democracy, because the filthiest ideas face a lot more pushback when they're directly exposed to public opinion that way, rather than being submitted through a ballot box or through the mail.
Yeah, I would very much so agree, because as far as I know, in the Roman model, you would have your election and your debates and your policies all in the same evening. It would all be in one single event, and people were all there as a gathering, and you got held accountable for saying what you said and for being right or wrong. You'd be shamed, and it would. I think this is one of the local tools that the Roman Empire had at its avenue to like last for so long, because if you take it out of like the control of like news people, it does reduce down into who can move the mob the most, which I guess isn't that hard, but you still have the opposition mob there rather than just a viewer relationship.
I'm glad to use the word accountability there, because that's one of the things that is really missing from modern politics, is any sort of accountability framework. To some extent, the separation of powers in the U.S. is supposed to be an accountability framework, but it actually just turned into a managerial framework. And I think Congress manages the executive branch a lot more than it holds it accountable at this point. And that's basically the case for most of how USG operates.
I still had a question about your thoughts on something with that. I think we've all maybe seen over the course of the last maybe 3 presidents, the Supreme Court has begun acting almost like a second Senate. That has power, and you have the mechanisms now through precedent that if you had the president and Supreme Court fully aligned with each other, you would effectively have an empire, and an imperial system. an emperor. And I'm curious if this, I think this is an inevitability personally, and I think this is one avenue that you get a more localized control of politics in America is you just embrace it. You get the Supreme Court and executive branch to kind of grow entwined to each other. There's a lot of risk in doing that because if you get the wrong people in charge, you have no ability to stop them. But if you have the right people in charge, they can't be stopped.
That's an interesting line of thinking. I actually have come to view the Supreme Court as a legislative branch. It's essentially taken on the role of Congress in many ways, which isn't how it's obviously not how it's supposed to be. I think one of the things about this, though, a sort of imperial judicial and executive branch, is that at the end of the day, the judicial branch is small and lacks the means to actually enforce its laws. If the executive is wholly on its side, then it can fill that role. But one of the problems is the executive branch is managed right by the legislators, and this is actually baked into the U.S. Constitution. I was reading the Constitution the other day in terms of how the executive branch is actually managed, and it's actually it's right there in the original text in terms of executive appointments having to go through Congress, and it's completely it's very vague in terms of what actually has to be run through Congress, and obviously the executive branch has grown massively compared to the size it used to be when the country was first founded. But there's actually a clear constitutional basis for the legislature actually managing the executive in a sort of in a way that's not really congruent, I think, with effective government. I mean, if you think about this in relation to how corporations are managed, right? The board of directors, which is more or less what Congress is, it holds the executive and the corporate body as a whole accountable, but the board shouldn't, I think, necessarily manage it directly, and you don't see this in at least not the corporations I've been in. The shareholders and the board don't they're not making these decisions in terms of approving who's hired, especially at the mid levels of the company, right? That's more or less just left to the executive, and if the executive doesn't do his job in terms of providing value for the company, then he'll be replaced, right? But in the U.S. government, you don't have the same accountability model happening. You have the managers directly interfering with who the president is allowed to have stationed under him, and that's baked right into the Constitution. So I think bypassing that problem by basically making a new legislature out of the Supreme Court is an interesting way to bypass that for sure. I'll have to put some more thought into that.
Yeah, it's definitely a pattern I noticed started with Bush with the Patriot Act, and I don't think libertarians back then were the biggest arguments against that, but I don't think they quite had the political science understanding of what that was heading towards. Under Obama, with a lot of the executive actions through the Supreme Court, you start seeing that organism of politics start becoming more organized, and I don't know. I'm trying to find an example of that in history currently. This is why I was reading Charlemagne, the history of Charlemagne from Reinhardt. I wanted to see if this was has this happened in the past, and I'm starting to become convinced this might have been an oversight of the founding fathers in America. I don't think they foresaw the Supreme Court and the executive branch intertwining like they are, because obviously the executive branch would tend to follow mob rule a lot more through the lens of the the electors of the president. Obviously, it's a weird relationship where you have the Congress being the raw democratic elements, and then the senators kind of taking on the long form politics, and it's almost like they go at different speeds, so there's a lot of back and forth between each other, and the executive gets elected every 4 years, and it usually is the embodiment of the political will of the time that then has to argue with the political will from 4 years before with the Congress. I don't know. it's a big rigmarole, but I don't think they foresaw the very slow speed of the Supreme Court being in alignment with the moderately paced speed of the executive branch in terms of like progress.
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of the separation of powers, the American founders were just totally wrong. What they explicitly, and like I said before, I don't like being too harsh on them. I think there's a lot of good things from American history, even from the Revolution. But this is one area where I think the facts are just overwhelming. They explicitly thought that ambition would check ambition. That's like the classic line you'll get. That the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, the legislature, and the president would all want to protect their own power, so none of them would be able to overwhelm the other. When the reality is that just hasn't played out at all, and that hasn't played out for a very long time. I mean, it definitely hasn't played out since like FDR, but even before then, that was never really a accurate assessment of how the American government functioned.
Yeah, I agree.
Linking this to the concept of morality, I think the model of the Supreme Court being a legislative branch kind of demonstrates how much more effective a body can be at enacting some moral framework when it's more constrained. You have hundreds of people in Congress that are subject to some extent to popular opinion, whereas the Supreme Court is more or less this politically detached entity that is a lot more unified in terms of what moral framework it's operating under. Right now it's basically progressivism with a hint of conservatism, and I think basically the judges have seemed to agree on that for the last several decades, right? And they're very effective at it takes one Supreme Court decision to lay out an entire moral framework on the country in terms of how businesses have to interact with its employees and customers and that sort of thing.
Right. It seems all of their actual successes in making a progressive neoliberal moral order has come from that one institution, because really we like to, even though we like to focus a bit on the Congress and the plebeians there, the Supreme Court is actually the supreme legislature, and then the Congress is there to make more specific laws within the parameters that the Supreme Court gives. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but that's how it works. And for Settler's point, separation of powers is a terrible meme, because obviously it's going to be more convenient for ambition if there's an organic consensus between elites rather than just continually warring against each other at the top. And they also seem to have a problem of thinking. They do think in this kind of sola scriptura, this kind of lack of people with individual interests, even though they seem to be so interested in restraining the ambitions of politicians. They forget that, okay, this piece of paper itself cannot preserve anything without people, and the people that are going to be running in these supposedly separate government branches will also have connections. They will have connections, ideological agreements. Perhaps they went to an educational institution with the same person that's in the other branch. They will have these connections that cannot be removed from the situation, and will inevitably allow instant collaboration.
I was thinking back to Mencius Moldbug's open letter, and he actually discusses how the Supreme Court operates way back in that letter, and he talks about how the Supreme Court is actually they're not making decisions on law, they're making decisions on ethics. That's what that's what the living Constitution is. That's what interpreting laws is, right? Is they're actually making moral decisions, not legal ones, in terms of what the accepted moral standard is at the time. Because these laws that are written down, they're not changing over time. What's actually changing is our perception of right and wrong. So I think this observation of how the Supreme Court behaves as a sort of moral arbiter has been made before in our neo-reactionary canon, even. And yeah, it's interesting because I think it just demonstrates really well how much more effective a small body of people, the branch of government that's furthest from politics, the Supreme Court, is actually the most effective at instituting some sort of moral framework in the country. And this is something that's not just a recent phenomenon, but has happened for at least 100 years in the United States.
Well, I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting that argument coming into this stream, but it makes perfect sense now that you point it out. And I just to put a stamp on it. It's interesting. I think Charlemagne and I were basically agreeing, but emphasizing different parts of the same problem. In that you were pointing out, okay, these competing factions and these competing religious factions, having that continue endlessly will not allow for a sustained moral order, because with politics and switching of hands in power, there's always moral change. And then I'm pointing out, and Seller was also pointing out, that we can't have any kind of effective, sustainable political expression without fundamental agreements between the elites on morality. So I guess the sense of agreement that we were having is we just needed one faction to win. We needed a standard bearer that actually won. And the problem is post-Reformation, these religious factions and their battles, which continued in Europe and then still continued a bit more muted when they reached America. It's precisely because one of them did not come to dominate, besides progressivism now, one of them did not come to dominate and solve the problem that we're having.
Yeah, I think you framed how we're approaching this pretty well. I agree with your framing there. I was thinking about, so it does seem that I think we would agree that although it wouldn't be desirable necessarily, if you simply removed the legislature from the equation, the U.S. would be much more competently governed if the Supreme Court basically just became a Senate with the executive branch basically left as it is.
Caesar, where are you?
Yeah, well, I wonder. So I know Anaquin said he kind of viewed this as inevitable. I wonder if you could maybe elaborate, if you thought about it, on like how you might see Congress being phased out if this is possible. I guess one thought I have on this is the Roman emperors phased out the Senate by basically just sort of making it this club that meets more or less. It's a club of not very competent wealthy people who more or less just rubber stamped what the emperor wanted to do and that sort of thing. So I wonder if you see maybe the U.S. heading in that direction at some point.
Yeah, I would say that one thing I've done when studying how these institutions were treated in the Roman Empire is that the Roman Senate does come off as more similar to the Supreme Court to start. That like they're like they're there for a very long time, similar to the Supreme Court. Although maybe our own Senate's kind of like that because so many people keep getting reelected. What I do know is that, we could probably say that the setup for this, the backdrop that caused this shift, might be as very well going back all the way to maybe even Teddy Roosevelt, if not FDR, where like the executive branch started taking these like really strong pushes on like a national level and using the Congress initially to like check them, but the Supreme Court kind of like, this is fine. And then towards the War on Terror, you saw the shift towards now the Supreme Court's going to be this entity which make sure that executive power can protect the people. Initially, it's like the big terrorist attack, we have to protect people, so the Supreme Court's going to take a little bit of a laissez-faire course on that to make sure we're safe. But at the same time, that laissez-faire approach to the executive is creating precedent because these were new issues that the country had never seen before. And the Supreme Court, I believe, that, correct me if I'm wrong, the Supreme Court primarily governs through precedent. It's not. It's like one of those relics of English law, where it's like, yeah. So I think maybe the Supreme Court was blind to its own self, creating these precedents. If you read a lot of their opinion pieces, they were like kind of aware that this was going into dangerous areas, but we'll just undo it. We'll just undo it. And almost 20 years later, we still haven't undone it. We've only expanded it. We've gone into spying on citizens. We've gone on to like borderline Chinese style things, which I don't think I should talk about too much. So I think, sorry, this is long-winded. I was just kind of casting a backdrop. I think if Trump gets reelected, it's very likely Ruth Ginsburg dies within his second term and gets replaced with one of his people. And at that moment, you'll have a pretty locked-in conservative court for the next generation with a conservative president who, if he can manage to do these things, and if he can use those 4 years well enough to set a precedent, a cultural precedent of like how a president should act, that's it for the old guard of doing things. Like the old school Republicans and Democrats culturally have no impact anymore. They can wail and argue, but they've kind of been phased out. If President Trump doesn't win and Biden gets in, you have an interesting kind of cheat where, Biden maybe is president for a year or 2 or 3 before he croaks, and then Kamala takes over and probably does a lot of crazy stuff to the Supreme Court in the same path. I mean, if she gets elected, she's going to be the power behind the throne, guaranteed. And so she's going to be working on her view of what the Supreme Court should be. She'll replace Ruth Ginsburg with a very whatever she is. I wouldn't necessarily call Kamala far left. I would call her more like a oligarchy person. And so at the same time, because Kamala herself is very pro-state, very for the, she's a former cop. She's very in bed with executive corrupt practices. I don't think that changes the outcome. Whatever court she replaces with Ginsburg with, it's still going to be someone who's pro-state, pro-imperial power. I think that's kind of pointing towards an inevitability of a very, very focused Supreme Court on permitting the executive branch to do whatever it needs to keep people safe. Fast forward that another maybe 8 years down the road, assuming Kamala gets reelected or Trump gets replaced with whoever comes after Trump, I don't see that changing. Maybe another Supreme Court justice dies and gets replaced by yet another pro-executive court. Like, this seems to be a trend no matter who gets elected.
My hopes with the scenario of Trump being in and then having a Supreme Court person and then being able to have some lasting precedent in this country, that was my hope half a year ago. But I actually think that your scenario, the inevitable scenario, is eventually once another progressive gets in, and they will, that's going to be the situation where you really get this alliance between the court and the president, like Cringewalker is talking about. Because the problem with the Trump scenario, Cringewalker, is that there is no precedent. This living constitution is not only alive, it's very vibrant, and it's running around like a maniac. So the problem is that there is no precedent, and once a progressive comes in, they will pack the courts with a larger amount of justices, because there's no rule against that we have right now. So the precedent is only what those in power want it to be. But yeah, this will eventually end up with an alliance of a packed court with a insane sociopathic progressive president, like Kamala. It's Kamala, not Kamala. Kamala.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they'll even need to pack the courts. I mean, they might, but I honestly don't see there being any serious chance of a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, even if Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies and Trump gets to appoint her replacement. I mean, it feels like this is like the 5th time we've been told that we're supposed to have a conservative majority. And every time it happens, it's like, oh, no, whoops, we actually appointed a liberal by accident. Like, if you just go by, there's at least 5 people on the Supreme Court right now that were appointed by Republicans. And that like, it just, it just keeps on happening. it's like, are any of these people really that good? Are any of them going to do anything? Like the sort of stuff that the left does routinely with the Supreme Court, we never do. Conservatives never do. Why hasn't the progressives, they don't even need to ask them. A lot of these progressives on the Supreme Court have been around forever. And like when they got appointed, they didn't need to go through it with each one of them and say, hey, are you going to legalize gay marriage in 10 years? All they needed to know is, are these progressives? Yes, they're all progressives. Okay, they'll always support the progressive agenda no matter what. That's all they really needed. Where with conservatives, we get like five people that are supposed to be conservatives, and we can't even get them to agree to like really basic conservative stuff. We had what was his name? I can't remember. But one of the so-called conservative justices was one of the ones that helped get the gay marriage ruling passed. This stuff just keeps on happening. And like the thing that Republicans have run on for like 40 years now with the Supreme Court is elect us so we can get people to overturn Roe v. Wade. Still hasn't happened. We've had so-called majorities on the Supreme Court multiple times, and we've never been able to overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, this just comes back to the cathedral. The ideological hegemony is all on the progressive side and not on the conservative side. So the incentive is always for the people that are in these fashionable circles to drift towards the progressive side, and that's why the progressive appointees are always down for all the progressive things, and the conservative appointees are only sometimes down for a few conservative things.
But Cringewalker, how are you supposed to, if they pass all those issues, how are they supposed to shake that moral crusade in front of their voters in order for them to vote for them and give them more money each 4 years? How are they going to do that?
This is actually, I watch the Daily Wire podcast a lot, I think it's important to sort of stay on top of what normie conservatives are listening to. And I just heard Ben Shapiro basically make that exact same argument the other day, where he said that he thinks the reason why why conservatives in Congress never really get any meaningful stuff done on, or it might have been one of the other Daily Wire guys, but I can't remember. It was one of them said that the reason that they think that they can't get any meaningful change done on abortion is because they love doing that. They love using it as a way to raise money and to get votes out and stuff. And if they actually got the abortion stuff through, then who would care anymore? I don't believe that at all. I think that's like a Beltway myth. That's the reason. They don't do it because they don't want to do it. They don't do it because like the consensus isn't on their side. Progressives get their stuff through all the time. They don't need to constantly dangle like gay marriage in front of them, saying, "Oh, well, elect us one more time and we'll finally give you gay marriage." They just do it. There's a million other conservative issues we could have, but we can't get like the main thing we've been asking for 40 years, like any restrictions on abortion whatsoever. And it just, I just don't, I don't believe that this argument that the reason they don't do it is so they can dangle it in front of people. Progressives never do that.
Yeah, just sorry.
I think there's another reason why these things don't get overturned. And thinking about what we've talked about here, the original framework that the founders set the U.S. on was basically this idea that the government exists to provide a framework for people to operate in, and that the correct form of government that is conducive to the interests of the people is one that basically let them pursue their own interests, right? That was sort of the moral framework. And the way we're going to do this is by keeping government limited. And the way it's going to stay limited is by having this system of branches that check and balance each other. So they're going to sort of mutually keep each other weak. But what actually happened was the opposite. Instead of sort of mutually keeping each other weakened, they actually entered into an arms race with each other almost immediately, where they all, and you see this, there are many examples of this, throughout the history of the U.S., of each branch of government trying to accumulate more power to itself. They don't actually chip away at each other's power. They just enter in an arms race with each other to gain more power for their branch. And now we're at this point where we have these sort of three massively bloated and powerful pillars of government, all trying to throw their weight around. And that's why. So there's no incentive to actually undo things you've accomplished in a system like this. Because, think about how the Cold War went, for example, with all of the arms limitations treaties that we tried to do. We still haven't gotten rid of the thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons stockpiles. People just kind of forgot about them, right? It's really difficult to convince people to get rid of things they've accumulated for themselves when they're actively in competition with other people for some form of power, right? So I think the whole system as it was set up actually leads towards what we're seeing now with these branches becoming more and more powerful, and it leads to it basically completely rebukes the whole idea of conservatism as we think of it, because the way the system operates, there's no incentives whatsoever to actually undo stuff, to actually go back and get rid of these things. Like, the Patriot Act was mentioned, right? Nothing that is accomplished by a branch of government that gives it more power, more tools and weapons to use against the other parts. Those are never going to be undone.
Yeah, I guess to link that back to morality, there's a question of why the people are okay with this, and where that moral basis for being okay with it comes from. I was just out of curiosity looking up the abortion debate, because Gallup still does weekly poll, I guess monthly polling on it, and I found it interesting that when Trump got elected, pro-life became the majority opinion, but up until around late last year, it went crashing down, and now pro-choice is the majority opinion. And I almost wonder what caused that, when, like, the pre right in the early days when quarantine started going in, basically we started seeing that shift, and this is just related to that, because, like, we can't really trust the people in power to make that moral decision clearly, because Trump claims to be pro-life, though he doesn't seem to make policies that are pro-life. But what's really interesting is that the majority opinion in terms of legal basis is that abortion should be legal under certain circumstances, and that since 1976 has only shifted 4% down. And so most of these arguments between pro-life, pro-choice, and moral arguments tend to seem to be majority ignored. Like, the legal under any circumstances is 29%, illegal under any circumstances is 20%. And that's together 60%. The majority are arguing, but the stakeholder percent, around half the country, still hasn't moved. It just doesn't care. And so why do they not care? Why is that a moral thing that they've just kind of not cared? Half the country just doesn't care, it seems.
One thing I would say in terms of polls like this is we definitely need to remember that these things aren't really scientific, because it's extremely difficult to actually poll people in a way that is truly representative of what the population at large thinks. So the numbers you gave out is basically it's about 20-20 on either side, and then there's this sort of 60% in the middle block that sort of wavers. And I guess what was your question exactly? Like, regarding
just in terms of morality and power, we've seen people switching out between pro-life and pro-choice all the time, but it seems like most people have just maintained, we should be legal under some certain circumstances. Illegal, like, most people don't think it should be fully legal or fully illegal. It's just this thing. It's like, gray, basically.
Well, unfortunately, it's the democratic meme. Whatever's really the population is always a couple years behind the elites, actually passing the policies that change the moral and social order. Really, it's just it reminds me of Moldbug describing it in the open letter, where it's like people were ready for civil rights legislation, barely. People were ready for Roe v. Wade when the Supreme Court passed it, barely. People ready for gay marriage, barely, whenever it's passed. The population is basically just it's a bias towards what has the least resistance. So they're going to be slightly behind the center of the ideology, the center of opinion of the elites leading them on. So essentially, they're just heeding to the consensus because that's what the consensus of the elites is.
I think the moral gray area is a result of there not being a consistent, objective moral framework that we are governed by. That's really the only way a gray area can emerge to that is if you don't have a consistent, objective judge of what is or isn't right. And I think in function, this gray area performs a sort of theatrical trick where it conceals the slow shift in one direction, because the gray area is this sort of it's sort of cloudy, right? Like the people don't really have a firm opinion, but it's not just that they don't have a firm opinion. It's that the general opinion slowly shifts in one direction, and I would imagine that the gray area's opinion is probably heading more towards allow abortion than not. And the further that progresses, the less likely it is that abortion is ever going to be further restricted, right? It's like what 21st Reaction mentioned from the open letter. The gray area eventually moves to the point where you can get away with certain things, even though they don't have a solid opinion either way. They'll sort of tolerate more in the progressive direction. So even though they're not explicitly aligned with the allow it all the time side, that the slow burn tends to lean that way because it's the path of least resistance. I mean, and that just makes sense, right? Because it's always more difficult to do good things and to hold yourself to a higher moral standard. The easier way is always the way that just sort of ignores that sort of framework. So it makes sense why the gray area would perform that function, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to segue, going from that exact point, segue into a more explicitly religious point about our current situation, because I actually think, in the current situation, the democratic meme, everyone's opinion has to matter. I actually think Charlemagne's point that people mostly act amorally in politics, they act in self-interest, and they will usually flow in the path of least resistance. I think that rings true as we have it right now, and I would posit the idea that having people, foggy, gray-minded people, apatheists and atheists. Just for the audience, apatheist is like someone that doesn't really care about the question of whether a God exists. So all these apatheists and atheists, it's preferable for the elites to produce those people in the broader population because they are so amoral. And so if you combine that cynical grabbing of wealth, status, and power with the idea that everyone's opinion matters, then it's very predictable the behavior of the mass population is much easier to control because it's much more predictable. They're going to go in this direction. They're going to pursue whatever's convenient for themselves. So I'm just going to make incentives that will push them in those directions, instead of something that's far more unpredictable, a person choosing to take off those interests and just pursue some kind of virtuous ideal.
Yeah, and I guess the overall incentive is just more freedom to do whatever you want individually, right? On its face, that seems like it's just generally in your interest to be given more degrees of freedom, and I think that's really what's on the table for most people at this point is the government or the progressives. They just want to provide more liberties or even more status to more people, and as an individual, why would you not go for that unless you had some moral framework actually anchoring you in place? So I think that gray area of people who aren't firmly rooted somewhere are very vulnerable to being exploited this way by being offered something that on its face seems like something that is just sort of globally desirable, but really there are certain insidious ways in which it actually isn't, and that's it's hard to. I think it's hard for most people to really wrap their minds around why restricting people's degrees of freedom is actually a good thing and even better for them at an individual level, because you have to sort of you have to think in these this meta sense that gets outside of your individual interests. You need to sort of know about these historical trends, right? But most people aren't educated in this way. They're just propagandized to. So I think they don't have this vision of how over time we've gotten here because of this very because of this liberating process that's happened to us, right?
Right. It's of course it's the paradox of liberal freedom that when you get more of this surface level freedom to do what you want, you are in fact easier to control and more enslaved. And I just wanted to mention Renaissance was bringing up the point of people are easy to control if you give them the freedom to become addicted to things like prawn. He's firing up the chat. I just had to mention it. But he also I also didn't understand one of the comments Renaissance was making. He's saying virtue in itself is overrated. Truth doesn't exist for virtue, but virtue for truth. And he was saying that to me. Is anybody able to clarify that for me?
No, I'm not very familiar with that, to be honest.
I don't know. I guess he can elaborate more in chat, but I don't want to speak for him by guessing what he might mean by that.
I mean, my point. I think he was responding to when I was saying that I was mentioning that the irreligious population is easier to control because you can offer them incentives, and you know that they will go towards whatever satiates their desires, as opposed to someone that pursues a virtuous ideal. Then you can't predict their behavior as well because you can't explicitly control them with these obvious incentives. But it wasn't really about whether they're pursuing truth or I don't know.
Well, thinking about that a little more, one thing we see on the progressive side is they believe that they have virtue, right, and that they're acting in a virtuous way, but they're certainly not acting upon truth. They're acting upon some worldview they want to institute, right? It's not about what's real. It's about utopia, right? And it's virtuous to fight against reality, basically. So I think that you sort of get this misaligned virtue if you don't maintain your focus on truth. And I think that is what separates the right wing's view of virtue and the left wing's view of virtue.
I think the comment that Seller is highlighting now makes it more obvious. Yes, Renaissance. I'm agreeing with. He is indeed waxing poetic in the comments right now, but essentially, I understand now that he was saying being a good person, doing good works, is irrelevant without the truth of a true religion. So yeah, I was hoping to segue it towards this conversation. So not only virtuous people are more difficult to coerce in the political sense, in offering them political incentives. Sorry, an explicitly religious one, you can't. It's just they're basically unstoppable.
I somewhat want to maybe ask about the opposite end of history with this, with in the Imperial Roman era, there were some moral codes, but by and large, like abortion was legal, prostitution was legal. A lot of the things that we today consider immoral were perfectly available. If anything, they were only banned in Rome. How did the Christians really get the cultural initiative to push that out and replace it with something more moral? And in our view,
they took power and they enforced their beliefs, same way everyone else does.
But they were popular. That's the thing.
Well, they coerce people into agreeing with them. Most people are easily manipulated and easily convinced through all sorts of propaganda and offering goodies for them. So it's a matter of time before you can get a population to accept one thing over something they previously believed, especially an irreligious one. I mean, think of the things that they've been able to convince the average person now, like all those social changes, homosexuality, divorce, abortion. Honestly, these things are no less crazy than what's to come, like hebephilia or whatever. I'm convinced now that like in irreligious populations you're able to convince them of anything. Honestly, the real red pill is the average person is so easily coerced and convinced whatever way.
I think one way the Christians were able to increase their own power is by exploiting the decline of the Roman Empire. You know, as a powerful force declines, that is to say, becomes less powerful, its degrees of freedom are limited. And when someone or something's degrees of freedom are constrained, they're going to have to make choices that aren't as ideal as the choices they would normally make, which can include making concessions to various groups, in this case, the Christians. And I think that the decline of the West actually presents another opportunity for Christians in this way, because as USG and other governments, as their degrees of freedom are limited when reality is confronted, that's something you can exploit to get some concessions made towards your point of view, and ultimately build that up.
I think the sort of decline that's been going on does sort of push some people that are just so disgusted with a lot of things that are happening towards different stuff. I mean, I don't know. There's probably a good chance I never would have become Catholic if it wasn't for everything going on currently. If I just had like a relatively happy, stable life, if this was like the 1950s or something like that, I may have never been incentivized to seek out other belief systems and stuff. So yeah, I definitely think that's a factor. Yeah, that's a bit odd.
I brought it up because along with what I mentioned with the growing unity between the courts and the executive branch, you also have the large Hispanic shift in America, which will, I think, make it a majority Catholic country pretty much within a generation or two. Obviously, the American Catholic experience is a little bit too light for anyone's liking here, I suspect, compared to like actual Catholic theology. But still, it will be the first time America is shifting from a Protestant to a Catholic view, which presents the possibility of establishing a firm, fixed moral view of things from like a source that people might say is more reliable than Protestant theology. I'll admit, but I just want what you guys think about that shift that's going to happen. That like along with the government shift, there's this cultural shift towards Spanish and Catholic theology.
In America, I mean, I know I doubt that's really going to happen. I mean, I know there's a lot of immigration from nominally Catholic countries in Latin America, but for one, I think immigration from other parts of the world is really starting to open up. I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be as Latin American dominated. And there is large not massive, but or it is. I mean, could be considered massive, but there are large conversion rates from Hispanics to evangelical Christianity. So I mean, Catholicism is definitely going to become bigger in the States, but I doubt it's really going to become a majority thing, even nominal Catholicism.
Yeah, maybe. I think one thing we have to ask ourselves here, and I definitely can't answer this, but maybe someone can, is what the actual state of the Catholic Church is in South America, because obviously it's not the same in every place, right? So what are South American Catholics actually like? What are their leaders like? I think that that's going to matter in terms of how this actually affects the standing of Catholicism in the United States. So, I mean, maybe that could even be a topic that would probably be worth streaming on if you could find someone who actually knows a bit about the Catholic Church in South America.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I do have a bit of a basic knowledge on it. I hear many different things from different people. I know some of the really like trad Caths I'll see on Twitter will say that they're basically all just syncretists, and there's very few real Catholics in Latin America. I feel like that's probably harsh, and not incredibly accurate, but I do believe sort of syncretism with like indigenous belief systems is much more common than it would be in other places. But saying that that's the norm or the majority or the vast majority, I have not seen compelling evidence to say that's true. But yeah, I mean, there's a couple notable things I know about Latin American Catholicism. One that I think the biggest issue for this though is the sort of meme that a lot of especially conservatives have been sold on mass Hispanic immigration to the United States is that like these are based Catholics and that you should be okay with this because it means that America is going to become more religious. This is completely a meme. The most, not all of course, but most of the Latin American immigrants that come to America are the most liberal sections of Latin America. Because if you just like think about who are the type of people that would want to come here, for one, they're going to be generally poor, so they're going to be generally more left wing. They're going to be immigrants, so they're going to be more attracted to pro-immigration political policies, and they're not going to be incredibly rooted in their existing countries, so they're not going to have the same sort of patriotism that they had. Now, again, that's all painted in broad brushes. There are, of course, Hispanics that come to America and are very right wing. You see this especially in the Cuban community, though even that's been trending left for a long time. But it just the idea that they're particularly conservative socially or politically is just not really true. They tend to be from the most left wing sections of these societies. With that said, if you just look at like abortion laws, abortion is illegal in almost all of Latin America. So they definitely are more socially conservative than America, at least in some ways. Though gay marriage is legal in most of Latin America, that is from court decisions, not from democratic politics. But there's also in several Latin American countries, there's very large amounts of Protestants because particularly Pentecostal missionaries have been very successful at converting a lot of them. And in many Latin American countries, the Pentecostals are the most sort of conservative part of society. Though that is to a significant degree because Catholic is kind of just the default, where most Pentecostals are converts, so the most religious people tend to be the converts. But yeah, so it's kind of complicated is, I guess, the best way to sum it up. But I'm not particularly optimistic about what it will mean for America's future because it's not just the immigrants are not just a representative swath of Latin American society. They tend to be the most left-wing people from Latin America.
Yeah, fun fact for the people that pay attention to the hamster wheel of monthly or annual political events, the Hispanics, especially the younger Hispanics, were a very significant faction for the Sanders campaign during the primary. So it's like he almost won Texas because they're basically more progressive than some of the older blacks in the South and South Carolina, which voted for Biden. So
I think what Settler said was a pretty good summary, and I think it could even be summarized as, the immigrants from south of the border are not self-selecting for conservatism or Catholicism. Actually, the opposite. They're self-selecting for people who are going to be more on board with the liberal and progressive policies, and for that reason alone, it's a losing game in the democratic game, right? And for that reason alone, it should be limited, even beyond ethnic identity or whatever, right? Just because of these people being more self-selecting for liberalism, that's a reason enough for conservatives to not want them to come into the country.
Yeah.
I mean, the left is pretty smart. They would not be supporting mass immigration if it didn't benefit them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. I only said that because I was in Latin America a few months ago and found it interesting. Like you said, they're very okay. I don't know if I want to say okay, but like tolerant of gay marriage, but very intolerant to like other progressive ideas of identity and abortion, because that's not only against the church but against like their local morality. I don't know. I was in Chile for like a few days. I think about 2 weeks or something, and I find it interesting that a lot of people kept asking me, "Is the American dream still real?" I this was asked multiple times by people once they knew I was American, and I was like, this is an interesting question to be asked. Is it still real? My only answer was the ability to do it, like the means by which you can achieve it, is now more difficult, but still there. It's just harder, and a lot of them were understood, but were discouraged by that. Occasionally, a mother, I think, there was one mother who asked if, well, it sounds like I should keep my kid here, and then after they get a degree, they can try to get a job there rather than sending them before the degree. A lot of them also didn't want to send their kids to America because the colleges were like awful socially. And I found that also interesting, where they wanted to maintain that power and cultural balance over their children, so get them educated in Chile, but they want that power under their moral guidance. So like once their kids are raised and in their own culture, then they'll send them to get the money and power in America. But like they don't want to lose that culture to American progressives.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, if these people do come here, can they withstand the forces of progressivism? And I don't think there's any particular reason why they would be able to, more than the people already in the country have been able to. So I don't see any sort of salvation through immigration coming. It's just not. I don't think it's up there.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, even with some of the most conservative immigrant groups, those usually tend to be the ones from the former communist countries. They tend to be pretty. They all tend to be pretty left wing, or I mean, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say at all. They're all trending to the left. Like Cubans have historically, ever since they left Cuba, they have historically been a pretty solid Republican voting base. But now they're trending left quite a bit. Older Cubans are still pretty Republican, but the younger generations are more left wing than the older generations would have been when they were their age. And same thing with Vietnamese, for again same reason, obviously, communism. Younger generations are trending left quite a bit, to significantly more than their parents would have been when they were their age. So it just isn't. It just isn't the same. I've kind of seen, just on an anecdotal level, I've seen a similar thing in Canada, where sort of Chinese people that have been in Canada for like several generations tend to be a bit more conservative, but the more recent, and usually because if they've been here for several generations, they're usually pretty anti-communist. While the Chinese Canadians, who are more recent immigrants, who are like first generation, tend to be more left wing. But yeah, so it just these even the sort of most conservative immigrant populations that we've gotten, they're not staying conservative. But with that, I'd like to do some super chats quickly. We only got two. First one's from Jedi Knight Anathan Cringewalker. I promised to donate. Haha. Thank you very much. And the second one is from Ben Amron. What if we returned to theocracy? It worked. I think this is actually a pretty interesting question, mainly because it's pretty massively cringe. I'm sorry. But no, seriously. Okay, this word theocracy, I hate it so much because everyone uses it wrong. People on the left, people on the right. Though this is the result of left-wing subversion, and you should not use just don't use the term theocracy unless you're playing like EU4 or something. Okay. Theocracy. What does theocracy mean? Theocracy means a government in which the legislatures are clerics. That's it. That's all theocracy means. Theocracy does not mean a government with a state religion. Theocracy does not mean a government that has laws passed that are religious. Theocracy just means a government in which the legislatures are clerics. Iran's a theocracy. Vatican City is a theocracy. That's it. Those are the only theocracies I can think of in the world. And we don't really have much of a history of theocracies in Western civilization. I mean, we of course had the papal states, and we had like Crusader orders, I guess, and we had some areas in the HRE that were theocracies. But for the most part, like if you think of a Catholic feudal monarchy, that's not a theocracy. There are theocratic elements to it, because bishops did hold real political power, but the government itself is not a theocracy.
Well, Settler, I prefer to defend Ben Emrem because he's been, saying some very base theocratic stuff in the comments. I would say that I admire his zealotry. But he did have one comment that I wanted to say. It's a biblical verse. We need one set of laws under one emperor, one king, and then I would add after that one God. So that's
yeah, no, I mean, okay, so I'm sure none of what I said there is what he meant by it. I'm sure when he says theocracy, what he means is the liberal meme of what theocracy, which is when you do right-wing things with some sort of religious pretext. Now, this is a ridiculous definition of theocracy because, for example, if you get like a liberal Democrat politician that says, I support Medicare for all, and Jesus would support Medicare for all too, because Jesus never charged anyone for healing them. This is something you'll see on like lefty Christian Twitter sometimes, a line like that. And no one would ever accuse them of being a theocrat for saying that. Though if you said a similar right-wing version of that, if you say you should oppose gay marriage because Jesus would oppose gay marriage, which again, that's like a stupid cringe way of putting that, but still that's something that you could see on a right-wing Twitter page. But no lefty would accuse the left-winger for saying Jesus would support universal health care of being a theocrat, because what they're doing isn't theocracy. They're just using religion to justify their political opinions. And neither is the right wing version of that. That's just having a that is just like that's just having a religious pretext. Now, what he's talking about is what you could say a state religion in a certain sense, or you could say just state involvement in religion. It doesn't necessarily need to be a state religion per se, but you can have governments that are that they don't have anything like constitutionally that talks about a state religion, but they're still very clearly religious governments. I mean, our government would be one of those where progressivism isn't explicitly in the Constitution, but either the Canadian or American government is still very clearly religious government, just for progressivism, not for Christianity. So if this, I'm sure this is what he's talking about is the concept of having religious involvement in government. And yes, I do believe that. I not only do I believe that, I don't think it really makes sense to have a government that doesn't have religious involvement in it. All governments have some form of religious involvement. All governments have some sort of moral system that backs up the things that they do. This is in Catholicism called integralism, I guess, which is just the idea that the state must be ordered towards the common good, and that Christianity is a part of that common good, and it has to be ordered towards that in some sense. There's a book that was written on it called Integralism by a priest that came out recently. I've been meaning to get that at some point, and I'll do a video or something on it. But yeah, so don't use the word theocracy. It's a stupid left wing meme. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't still be certain religious influences in government, because it doesn't make sense not to say that, and the government should be ordered towards the good.
Wow, that was an epic S tier rant, King. Can't believe it.
Yeah, sorry.
So
I mean, this is a topic that really annoys me, because you get both lefties and righties making the same mistake constantly. I mean, lefties are doing it because they want to attack us, so like whatever, I don't care. But you get righties falling into this, saying, "Oh, we should have a theocracy." You don't know what that word means. Just stop being cringe. I'm sorry. I love you, Ben Amran. You gave me money, but just don't use that word. But and no, I mean, like, Saudi Arabia isn't a theocratic monarchy. Just to respond to what he just said in chat, it's just a religious monarchy. Again, this is just like a left-wing meme way of redefining theocracy. But we actually just got another super chat, so I'll read this one out now. American Spaghettio for $5 says, American communists talk about communism in Cuba or Vietnam in a way that convinces second gens that communism is a part of their cultural heritage. I mean, this is not something I have any personal experience with, so I don't really know if that's true or not. But that's awfully interesting if that is an accurate way of what they do. Anyone have anything to say to that?
Sorry, I was just donating to Settler's Lament for the epic theocracy rant.
Wait, yeah, I'm doing that too, but.
Speaking of which, everyone, please remember to donate to Settlers Lament, and to go to subscribestar.com/Settlers Lament to make donations.
Very true. I just wanted to point out there's a heretic in the comments, Geoff Jordan. and he's making a comment. Everything evolves, literally everything. Religions, people, government, ideology, nothing ever stays the same for long. Christianity and democracy were always going to become what they have. Now, of course, he presumes for himself what is predetermined, so don't do that. But I would say that there's been one institution for one religion that has not changed throughout all time. So enough with this nonsense. I for me, would make me go on a rant in the same way that Seller goes on a rant about theocracy, is that people presume that these progressive Christian heresies were just inevitable and everything, and since they exist, that therefore Christianity is wrong. It's just more Wignatism, and I just don't accept it.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Charlemagne.
I wanted to actually address that super chat and not just skip over it with memes.
Yeah, that's what
communism. Yeah, so this is interesting. So I'm kind of curious if, he's kind of seen this happen personally or not, because this is an interesting idea. It's kind of like fabricating a fake nationalism for second generation immigrants to get behind. If they actually identify with communism as part of their legitimate cultural heritage and not something that was grafted on, that could be a very, very powerful tool. So that's something I haven't thought about before and wasn't really aware of as an active tactic. But I'm curious to the extent this actually works on immigrants from these countries.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, it's not something I have much experience with. But yeah, it does sound very interesting. I know, just having some experience with post-communist immigrant communities, not a lot, but there is definitely still very anti-communist sentiments even among some of the younger generations. Like I remember from some of these communities just in my local city seeing like protests from them against communism, which I haven't seen any other group of people doing stuff like that. So sort of the sort of anti-communist sentiment even among younger generations certainly exists. It's just been whittled down a lot. But yes, reaction to your point about everything evolving. I actually think he's somewhat correct that everything, I wouldn't say everything evolves because that's using, again, like stupid Enlightenment terminology. Everything changes to some extent. And that actually even does include the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church does change. This is St. John Henry Newman talked about this. The difference between a development and a corruption. In Catholicism, we have the concept of development of doctrine. That is, if you look today, there are things in Catholicism which are explicitly there, which only would have been implicitly in more primitive forms of Catholicism earlier, where we would argue that these things are logical deductions of what was given to us in the apostolic deposit of faith, but they weren't necessarily things that were always explicitly believed. One good example of this is the Immaculate Conception of Mary. We believe that Mary, from the moment of her conception, was preserved free from all stain of original sin. Now, the Church Fathers didn't really believe that explicitly, and that might sound something that would be like shocking for a Catholic to say, that we believe something dogmatically that the Church Fathers didn't explicitly believe. But the issue is the Church Fathers didn't believe in the concept of conception because no one really believed in the concept of conception. Conception is actually a really modern concept, and most primitive cultures did not believe in it. I read this study once actually that was talking about the views of primitive tribes that exist today and their views on certain sexual matters. There are a bunch of different things, but one of the things they talked about was conception. And the study said that virtually none of them believed that conception was a one-time occurrence. They believed there was some sort of development where it became human over time. And this is what many older Christians used to believe, that this is what many older Christians used to believe, that life didn't really start at one moment, or if that one moment did happen, it wasn't earlier on. I'm not saying that no Christians believed in conception, but it was less common earlier on to respond to Renaissance men. So the sort of the idea that like concepts of installment and conception are something that sort of developed later on. We would say that for the Immaculate Conception, that there are very clear things in the Church Fathers which point towards it, and that sort of developed out of our later knowledge on the matter. So doctrine does develop. It's like a really sort of classic example of this would be if you've ever taken a logic course in university, one thing that they'll often sort of explain to you for basic logic is the I don't know if syllogism is the right term for this, but the concept that Socrates is a man, men are immortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. So a development of doctrine in a very basic sense would be basically just the sense that, say, the Church Fathers said Socrates is a man, and they said Socrates is immortal. So the logical conclusion that you could later come to that from is Socrates is immortal. Catholicism changes in the sense that doctrine develops further, but that isn't what we normally would think of when we hear the word change. But yes, of course, when we talk about other religions, they do just contradict each other constantly. Like EOs who used to believe in purgatory and now they don't believe in purgatory, or Protestants or EOs who almost all of which would have condemned contraception until about 100 years ago. More recent for EOs, but still. But yes, I have had quite a few new super chats come in, so I guess we should deal with those. Is Charlemagne donating for epic theocracy rant? Thank you very much. $2. Violinist for $2. A state based on religion, based on what? Thanks, violinist. Son of Tiamat for $2. Thanks for calling out the Wignats, Charlemagne.
I guess that's general and not specific to the stream, but yeah, thanks.
Calling out the Wignat Geoff Jordan here. So
yes, Ben Amron for $5. So Moses ruling over Israel was not theocracy. Wasn't God himself and ordering the Hebrews around? That's what I mean. Again, Zach 14. Yes, ancient Israel, before the time of the kings, was one of the what was one of the reasons. Ancient Israel was one of the times when there was an actual legitimate theocracy. My main point was that in Western civilization, Renaissance man is right. Moses wasn't the theocrat. But ancient Israel could validly be described as a theocracy before the time of kings. But I was talking about like Western civilization. If we have to go back like 3,000 years, this is a bit pushing it. And I think the fact that God doesn't really rule us in the direct way that the ancient Israelites did. So I don't think that's an incredibly useful model. If it was going to be reproduced, I think we would have seen it reproduced throughout European history at some point or another. But yes, and it's like, I don't know, like the Papal States was fine and stuff, I guess. I just don't really have any particular desire to like redo the Papal States. I don't know. This kind of seems like a thing that's been done and gone. And Brad for, I think, $8 Australian. AUD, I'm assuming that means Australian. Thoughts on Scott Adams' book, God's Debris and the concept of meme, and the concept / meme of us being God's debris.
I haven't paid attention to Scott Adams in a long time, so I don't know anything about his new book or what exactly it means that a meme.
I haven't heard of this at all. So
it kind of sounds.
I mean, I'm pretty sure Scott Adams is an atheist. So,
oof. But it does kind of sound almost polytheistic, like where like little pieces of God's greatness is falling off of him, and that's what we are. But we are not God. We are distinct from God. So that it's almost like it would have to have a polytheistic assumption for us to be God's debris.
Sounds like Gnostic gobbledygook to me.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I really wish I really wish I could comment on that because you gave me money, but I have no clue what that's about. So sorry.
I would say generally on Scott Adams, he can only see things through one lens. That's his persuasion lens, and it's really good when it is applied to things related to persuasion. But it's not a universal. It's not applicable universally. So take Scott Adams with a grain of salt, lots of salt. Use him where he's proficient, but not generally.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like this is probably a good place to end off, unless anyone else has anything else to say.
Just thanks for having me on. That was fun.
Yeah, and to respond to Renaissance Man, I mean, I'm assuming I'm assuming by debris, Scott Adams doesn't mean like literally where like hunks of God's flesh. So but I have no clue. Like I said, I'm sorry, I just really haven't. I haven't seen anything from Scott Adams in years.
Yeah.
But yes, everyone, please remember to donate to Settlers Lament, subscribestar.com/Settlers Lament, and also join my Discord server. I'll post a link to that too. I'll be hanging around in Discord after this, so feel free to come along if you want to hang out. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining me, and goodbye.